A biblical perspective on life, culture and current events. This is 2020 on Vision.
A note, though, about the conversation, we'll be discussing online sexual exploitation of children, and this can be confronting. So it may be one of those conversations where you might choose to shield little ears in your care, and for some this may trigger some hurt or even some deep emotions. But do stay with us if you can, because I think an important conversation coming as we talk about an issue today that should attract the attention of every concerned Australian and certainly every parent. That's because the online exploitation of children and minors is a real and present danger today. Every family on some level does their best to shield and protect their children from it. And it may be a comfort to you that there is a national advocacy campaign calling on Australians, and in particular Australian Christians, to advocate for stronger national online safety laws. Our special guest today is in the battle to protect children and young people. David Braga is the CEO of International Justice Mission. David, a special welcome along to 2020.
Thank you, Neil. Really appreciate you having me here. Thank you.
David, we're going to talk about Australia shortly, but online child exploitation, it seems to be really having significant effect on those families, those children around Southeast Asia, or at least where there's some Australian connections there. I wonder if you can give us your insight about just how bad the issue of online child exploitation is.
Yeah, I'm sorry to say, and it is quite confronting, that the problem we're dealing with is very significant in some parts of Asia. So what we're talking about is live-streamed child sexual abuse, where perpetrators find traffickers in their country who then expose children to this abuse online through the normal technology platforms that we use all the time. We've done some work in the Philippines, and sadly that showed that this was from 2022, 1 in 100 children were being exposed to this, and that was about 500,000 children in total. The median age of the children we're talking about is 11, and the average length of abuse was 2 years. The other element of this that's really sad is that over 80% of the traffickers were either their parents or other relatives. So unfortunately, this crime is really endemic now in some parts of Southeast Asia. And I do want to say the Philippine government takes this really seriously. This isn't something that they're sitting back from. They want this fixed. So it's something we all want to address and protect these young children from harm.
And Southeast Asia is primarily the area you're working, but if we're talking globally, as I understand it, something in the vicinity of 50 million children and women and men are beaten, raped and starved in an industry worth something in the vicinity of $150 billion globally. The size of it is huge, and it does seem to be that very few people are talking about it.
Yeah, Neil, those numbers are the wider problem of people who are in what we call modern slavery overall. So the online sexual exploitation is one particular form of trafficking and abuse. But as we can all, imagine, if you like, there's all types of abuse across the world, from bonded labour, other forms of vulnerable people being harmed against their will through violence, where people are acting with impunity and they just can't escape that situation. So those numbers are horrific, and that's the global problem that we're all trying to deal with, grapple with.
Let me come to one of the more disturbing elements that you mentioned as you're describing the issues in the Philippines and perhaps across Southeast Asia, is that it's often parents using their children as like an online commodity. That's disturbing, isn't it?
Oh, it's very disturbing, and the stories that we see of young people who are exposed by their parents to this is really distressing. So often the children are lured in to appease the parent or their aunt or uncle. They don't understand what's happening to them, and they're being exposed in this way. Obviously, for financial gain, the reality is that these sessions generally are costing very little for an Australian, maybe $50. But for somebody in one of these countries, they can earn a month's pay in a day. And so there's a lot of attraction for them, unfortunately, in doing this. Now, it's also important to remember that poverty isn't an excuse for this crime. It is a crime. There are many people who suffer from poverty but don't traffic their children. And so we need to continue to uplift them and say this is a crime of opportunity. Many people, even after they've started, sadly continue. So it can't just be about earning money and paying the bills, as it were. This is a crime of opportunity that once people start, they don't stop.
And as you say, child exploitation, just a part of the bigger picture that we might be thinking of as slavery. If you've got a thought or two, a comment here, because the idea that slavery, people who are trapped in some form of slavery, is bigger now in 2024 than at any other time in human history. And I guess this commodifying of children, online child exploitation, part of that, but bigger than ever in history. How do you make sense of that?
Yeah, Neil, a lot of the problem that we see in terms of people being trafficked in general slavery is caused by migrant workers. So when people need to travel for work, they're often then in an environment where they don't understand the rules, they don't know what the industrial relations laws are for the country that they're in. They may have had to cross borders by using people smugglers to get across borders, and so they just don't know what their legal rights are. Those people are then prime for being abused and put into situations where they're coerced into an environment that they don't understand and then forced to stay and work there. The other risk that happens are desperate people looking for work who then put themselves into that situation of trying to find a job and go across border as well. And unfortunately, lots of people take advantage of those individuals and put them into a situation where they're forced into labour and jobs that they don't want to do, didn't realise they'd have to do, and can't get out of. Often the bonded labour situation that comes in there is where they're forced to try and repay someone for a debt. So this happens a lot in different countries around the world, where individuals may have a family member who's sick, and so to pay the doctor's bill, they agree to go into a labour situation to repay the debt. They get loan sharked across. And those people then take advantage of them, put them into a compound, tell them that they've got to do whatever the particular type of work is, and they won't be released until they pay back their debt. Those environments are prone for abuse, and those people can never repay the debt. It's set up to fail. They're made to pay for accommodation and food in a way that doesn't allow them to ever pay back the money that it's claimed that they owe. And so they can never escape that position, and it's inhumane. Often then there's physical abuse. People get beaten and required to work extraordinary hours at menial work to just make it happen. And the number of stories like that are just horrific.
David, what about the Christian believer? That person who's listening into our conversation today, For some, this will be new information. Never heard of this happening before. Didn't know it was on that sort of scale. I'm quite happy in my community setting. What are you calling on Christians to do to support initiatives with International Justice Mission that Christians can become involved in from our end and be supportive of the good work you do?
Yeah, we think so. If I just give you a little bit about the work that we do, we then act to try and strengthen the justice system around the world. So to act for these people, that means putting investigators on the ground. It means putting lawyers on the ground. It means putting aftercare specialists, so social workers, on the ground. And we work case by case to find these people, see how they have been let down by the legal system and get that fixed. And so there's a lot of work that goes on to build a local domestic situation. Often the law is in place and what's happening is against the law already, but the law is not being enforced. And so what we do is go in there to help a local law enforcement provider actually be able to enforce their own law and put that into place for people. What we need is some financial capacity to do that. So we do ask people to help support us financially. You can do that by going to our website, which is www.ijm.org.au, and provide us financial support to pay for those people on the ground. But we also love having people's prayer support. So if you go to the website as well, you can sign up for prayer support, and we put out a weekly prayer email with updates of the work that's going on around the world. We know that our God hates what's happening to these people. We know he sees each person for the individual that they are, and we know he loves and cares for them. The way he does that is through action by organisations like IJM, but it's fed by God's people acting to do that work. And as the body of believers, that includes us in Australia, and we can contribute through these ways to helping him take that action in the world.
Helping you make sense of life, culture and current events from a biblical perspective. 2020 on Vision.
Our talkback line open 1-800 316 316. To join in our conversation, you might have your own thoughts about online exploitation. We're talking about online child sexual exploitation with David Braga. He's the CEO of International Justice Mission, ijm.org.au, to find out more about what these guys are doing. Let me come to what I think is perhaps even one of the more disturbing elements of what we'll talk about, David, and that is that Australians are significantly caught up in contributing to the sorts of exploitation we're talking about. Are there statistics, or how do we know that Australians are caught up in this way?
Yeah, Neil, unfortunately it is the case. So there's a few different ways that we can see that sadly Australia is a significant perpetrator of this crime. One is from ground level, places like in the Philippines. The Philippine Anti-Money Laundering Council has looked at the money flow coming into the Philippines to pay for sexual abuse material. And from the analysis they've done, Australia was ranked number 3 behind the US and the UK for these types of payments, and that's by both value and by volume. And so that's if you look at it from on the ground in the Philippines. But then from here in Australia, the University of New South Wales, for example, did a study last year of about 2,000 Australian men that found that 2.5% of those men in that survey had knowingly and deliberately viewed child sexual abuse material. And so we've got this dual problem of we can see that Australia's perpetrators, when you look at it from on the ground in the Philippines, but you can also see that Australians are drawn to this material as well from the research at this end.
So you've got Australians in the privacy, let's say, of their apartment or their bedroom, and they're accessing online material. And perhaps not knowing just how significant it is that they're fueling the exploitation of children. I wonder if you think of there being a sort of a disconnect by what Australians might think, and yet when they're spending money for this online exploitation, sexual exploitation, they're actually fueling a huge destructive industry.
Yeah, it does feel like there's this disconnect of maybe, I don't see it as a real crime because it's remote to me, but we need to remember that every session is an actual abuse of a person, of someone created in God's image, and that is abhorrent. And so each time this happens is an abuse of a person, and we can't allow the fact that it's happening remotely through the internet to feel like this doesn't actually have impact. It has real impact on the children at the other end. There's many parts of research showing the trauma, the anxiety, the depression, the guilt that it creates for these survivors, and then that becomes part of the process they have to work through when they're rescued from these environments, and it drives a lot of the additional aftercare that they need to restore them to being to understanding and being able to cope with the way they've been harmed.
What does it do to the reputation of a nation when this sort of research comes out? And as I understand it, it's not just the one study you were talking about, but there's multiple studies putting Australians right there, number 3 ranking as a source of those transactions. What does it do for the reputation of a nation when this is going on from here and fueling that exploitation in Southeast Asia?
Yeah, I think it's something we should be ashamed of as a nation, frankly, and say, how do we allow these things that happen in the dark to continue to occur? So many of the people I talk with really grapple with that and say, how can we have a stronger and better discussion within Australia to identify this and put things in place for people who may be already acting this way or be tempted to have ways to break that pattern and intervene for them. I'm not sure that we've quite found that yet, but it's something for us to strive to say, this actually doesn't reflect well on us as a society. What are we going to do about it? That's something that's worth looking at.
Now, tell us about your work, International Justice Mission, improving online safety. What can we do about it? Is there solutions? And I know that places you're working in the world, helping to reduce these things happening. What are some solutions here?
Yeah, we think that Australia already has a really strong Online Safety Act, one of the best in the world, but it was only introduced 3 years ago and it's going through a review right now. So we think it can be improved as part of this review. When you look especially at how tools like artificial intelligence have been improving, we think that the technology companies should be held to a higher standard to block this material as it's produced. And that could either be from the sending end or from the receiving end. It could be blocked. And there are examples today of technology that can do that. And so we think that the large technology companies whose platforms are being used in this way should be given a legal duty of care to oblige them to consider how their platform could be used and put preventative measures in place to stop that from happening. If you think about it, it's like having 40 km/h speed zones around schools. We do that to protect children. Why is our technology that we're using not built with the same sorts of standards in place to protect children? And so we think the Online Safety Act should be strengthened to do that. And then we're talking about big companies. There needs to be significant penalties and fines associated to make sure that they do it.
National online safety laws. Our special guest today is in the battle to protect children and young people. David Braga is our guest. He's the CEO of International Justice Mission. David, before we get into some more of the disturbing issues and details around those, just to lighten things a little, just to talk about you and your family for a few moments, because you clearly have a long Christian history in your family. And as I understand it, your family reads Psalm 103 on every birthday. And your dad found that there's written evidence of that dating back as far as the 1850s, 170 years. One of those family traditions that's just fabulous. How do you feel about that being part of a long tradition that goes back generations?
It's amazing, isn't it? I mean, we read in the Bible that God says he acts through generations and for multiple generations, and it's very humbling to be in a family that's the case for. But I love it just as part of that legacy of family heritage and what we taught in the story we tell amongst ourselves. But Psalm 103 has that middle bit about the Lord being compassionate and gracious, slow to anger, abounding in love, and it's just beautiful. So my encouragement for everyone listening is you can be the start of something. Like, if your family doesn't do that yet, that's okay, but you can be the start of something for generations. So it's a beautiful thing to feel part of now. My children love it, and it's just amazing. So everyone can start. No, it's not too late to start a family habit that can last for generations into the future.
And you know, when I was doing this little bit of preparation, researching our conversation late yesterday, I saw that about you, and I thought, I'm going to open up Psalm 103, and I read it, and you know what? That's the sort of psalm that I want to speak over my family. And I think for listeners, open up Psalm 103. It might be inspiration today as we talk about the difficult and disturbing and very dreadful issues we are, that the generations that follow you may well benefit from this particular generational thing that's gone on in David's family, Psalm 103. Hey, come back to the seriousness now, David. And I wanted to ask you about Australian families. We've been talking about families in the Philippines primarily and throughout Southeast Asia. We've had a cost of living crisis here in Australia. Is this one of those things, online child exploitation, that we're even seeing amongst Australian families?
Yeah, Neil, unfortunately it is. So the federal police have an Australian centre to counter child exploitation, and sadly, so known as the ACE, it's up in Brisbane, and unfortunately they have examples of Australian children also being coerced into live-streamed sexual abuse, some as young as 8. And so it is something that happens across all sorts of boundaries, and even here. The other element to this that concerns us is, even if it's just people here looking at material generated in other countries, we think that does generate a risk then of harm in Australia for Australian children. There was a Finnish NGO called Protect Children who did a survey of people on the dark web and found that 37% of the people who they'd surveyed who'd used sexual abuse material had then attempted to contact a child after viewing that material. So it does look like there's a knock-on effect here of using child sexual abuse material into generating potential risk for children in your proximity. And so the fact that we're so concerned about this happening needs to be the case for our local community as well.
What do you make of Australia's e-safety commissioner, Julie Inman-Grant? Is this an advantage for dealing with these issues, both in Australia and what's happening to our near neighbours to the north? Is she effective?
I think we need to say that the e-safety commissioner has been incredibly effective in what she's been looking to do. So the Online Safety Act that Australia has was world leading at the time. It's one of the few in the world. It can be better, and I can comment on that in a moment. So we can see how it can be strengthened. It was only new legislation 3 years ago, so it's fair that it could be improved. But the way that the E-Safety Commissioner has looked to deploy it and use it has been incredible. And when you hear her talk and use the metaphor, for example, of water safety, to say that's how we treat, as Australians, our approach to the surf and to the water, it just makes total sense. And so I think we need to encourage her as a Christian community to be praying for her in the work that she does, and to support her in terms of what else can be done to protect our children in this Wild West that the online environment has become.
And when we're talking social media and our children, what do we make of the discussions and debate around a ban on children under the age of 16 from using social media? Because clearly that would be the way that perpetrators and exploiters would connect with children and with families. What do we make of that proposal?
Yeah, it's a really good discussion, isn't it, that's happening at the moment in terms of socially what that means for us and whether it's a good idea or not. As IJM and the work that we're doing in terms of the sexual abuse that happens for children, the reality is putting those verifications in place won't protect the children we're talking about. Unfortunately, what we're dealing with is often perpetrated by other adults who traffic the children, and so those protections won't help us with this crime. But it's a good conversation for us to have to say the technology platforms have just been allowed to operate without worrying about child safety for too long. And that can't be accepted anymore. And we need to look at putting child protection into these platforms. That may mean age verification for accounts for children, but it definitely means doing something different to prevent online sexual exploitation of children being live streamed.
So age verification might be a helpful initiative here in Australia. That doesn't necessarily mean it will be helpful offshore. How does all of this work?
Yeah, unfortunately, because especially the crime we're talking about is perpetrated by adults. So it's normally adults in Australia who contact other adults in a country like the Philippines, and then it's those adults in the recipient country who are facilitating and trafficking the access to children there. And so that's unfortunately why something like age verification won't actually protect those children.
Now, I want to be solutions-oriented and just to share with listeners if there are some things that listeners can do in their own family, in their own community, in their own church community, or even more broadly across their suburb or their town or their city. When we talk about ways that we can protect ourselves and ways that we can make people aware that these things are happening, what sort of initiatives do you think we could work with as ways that Christian churches can help lead a battle to end this modern online sexual slavery?
Yeah, I think we need to be advocating strongly. Countries like Australia have a really strong voice in setting the tone for what we think is acceptable. And as I've just said, for too long, we've allowed the platforms to be built in whatever they want. We should be saying the onus is on them to make sure that their design, their business model, their algorithms have more safeguards built in to protect children from harm, and just say this is no longer an acceptable position that we're in, where they can just build their technology any way they like. And so to have that legal duty of care to consider child safety and do something about it. Now, who do you talk to about that? The place to talk is actually to your local federal member of parliament. So we've had a campaign through the year, and if you contact us through the website www.ijm.org.au, we can help facilitate that contact into your federal member of parliament to say, as Australia looks at our Online Safety Act, let's make sure that it's designed with child protection at the heart of it, that we won't accept the continued position where children are harmed through the use of this technology.
Let's assume that politicians on every side, whatever flavour, are going to be in favour of putting a stop to this sort of online exploitation. So really, whoever your local member is, so if you were wanting to get an initiative started, and I know that you work with sometimes churches hosting a Freedom Sunday, that could be something that could be perpetuated across a whole community, even a whole state or a whole nation. So it depends on how you approach these things. But is that a possibility that you get your local member involved and it becomes a broader community initiative and not just something you're doing locally?
Yeah, absolutely. Thanks, Neil. The way we love to work as IJM is through church communities. And so, as you've said, we'll come out and bring the team and run a Freedom Sunday to help equip your church to understand whether it's this problem or others that we deal with around the world, and see how we as Australians can make a difference to thousands of people's lives. So, if we took this action on online safety, that's thousands and thousands of children that would be protected around the world. And so, harnessing your local church community to take that step forward is a terrific thing to do, and we would love to do that with you. Again, if you reach out to us through the website, there's details there of how to get involved with a Freedom Sunday, and we'd love to come and talk to you about that and join your community and bring your fellow Christian believers along the journey with us.
And I'll give the website just shortly at the end of our conversation. There's other issues, aren't there? So far as we're talking about online sexual exploitation of children in Southeast Asia, and disturbing fact that Australians are perpetuating that in a significant way, paying to see that content. But there are other issues that are also in play. One of those is the scamming that's involved. And young people who are drawn into scams. Let's just spend a few moments here, because this is another area that you work on, and I don't want to lose the momentum talking about the sexual exploitation of children, but scams are also something that's very significant and severe.
Yeah, we all know how horrible it is to feel like, we get all these scam messages every day from all around the world. We get people who unfortunately fall victims to those scams. What we may not realise, though, is that the people who are sending those messages are often forced into it and are being made to do it against their will. So sadly, what we've seen since the pandemic is the growth of these compounds in Southeast Asia, particularly, that are just scam factories. And the people in there, there's an estimate there's up to 300,000 people now in scam factories around Southeast Asia. And sadly, most of them have been trafficked into those and are doing that work against their will. IJM has worked with over 350 survivors from those compounds. And these are people who were migrant workers typically, so looking for a job. They responded to an ad, often on Facebook and platforms like that, that looks like a good job. They were lured into it. They were made to work for the job. That gave it a veneer of looking like it was a real job. And then when they turned up for their first day of work, they were driven across the border into a compound, locked away, and forced to do this scamming activity that we all hate. And the survivors and the stories that they tell, they know it's wrong and they hate doing it, but then they're forced to do it. They're often beaten. I've met a survivor who the people around him were electrocuted with electric batons if they didn't comply and meet their targets, and so that forced them to all do the work. This is also another form of slavery that unfortunately has become really prevalent in our region, and we need to do more. We're doing so much as a country to try and protect ourselves from the scams, but we need to also take action to go and rescue these people. And in doing that, that can help reduce how much scamming activity there is as well.
And of course, this is another dimension of your ministry with International Justice Mission, that you actually are into helping victims of these crimes. An aftercare that you call it. So the aftercare, how does that work, or how widespread is that? Is it something that's it's ad hoc? Only whenever there is someone who comes to your attention. How does that all work?
Yeah, no, the aftercare is very well described and defined. So we've got a framework called an assessment of survivor outcomes, which we use to individualise each person's care. And so as we're working with survivors of crime, we can sit down and we assess them on these different factors. So, for example, safety, legal protection, mental well-being, economic empowerment, social support, and physical well-being are the 6 that we measure that individual for. And then there's all these sub-measures inside, things like access to stable housing, making sure their housing is safe, that the household is supportive of their well-being. And we can use that to do both as a point in time, where's this individual at, but then also to assess how they've changed over time and whether they're making progress. And it normally takes a couple of years for people to work through all those different steps, if you like, an individual action plan for them to be put back into a situation where we can say that they're restored. So if I go back to the online sexual exploitation as a topic, IJM has been involved in over 400 operations to rescue individuals. From those operations, we've rescued over 1,300 victims, and of those 1,300 victims, we've got almost 400 survivors, and that gives you a sense of how that process and how long it takes to work through in terms of making sure you've got diligence about treating each person properly as an individual, and knowing what they need to be restored.
Disturbing to appreciate that it is Australians who are a part of the problem here, those who are perpetuating this online sexual abuse by paying for services coming from Southeast Asia. There's a reminder here, David, and short on time now, but I wonder, a spiritual reflection here. It's a reminder that not everything is good in our world. And I wonder if you've got any thoughts here. Where is God in all of the challenges that are being faced? And what's the responsibility of his followers who might be working according to his mission to be a part of, some ways, helping to end or at least relieve some of this pain and trauma of exploitation? Any thoughts here if you're reflecting on those things about God?
Yeah, I think I've loved the words of Psalm 94 since I've started doing this work. So in Psalm 94, you have these evildoers who are full of boasting and say that they will crush people, they'll oppress people, they'll slay people. That's what we see every day in this work. That idea of evildoers who think that they can act. In verse 7 it says, "The Lord does not see, the God of Jacob takes no notice." That's their attitude. But the good news is that they're wrong, that God does see, God does act. The psalm continues to say, "Does he who fashioned the ear not hear? Does he who formed the eye not see?" Like, God sees, God hears, and the way he does that is through his people. And so this work is an incredible work of God's body of Christ. So acting in the country to protect those individuals, but also acting here in Australia through us contributing in the way that we can to make this happen. It's a beautiful lesson that the body of Christ works across all different ways, with each of us playing our part. But if you don't play your part, the work doesn't get done.
There are evildoers, and God does see, and his action will be through his people. And I think we've just heard a call to action. We mentioned things like churches hosting a Freedom Sunday, and the thought that you could even include your broader community, because everyone on all sides of politics supports this. It's something that you can call your community to, a day of action, a Freedom Sunday. Working in partnerships with churches, hosting a local prayer gathering, having a speaker from IJM, the International Justice Mission, come to your church or gathering to talk about these sorts of things. Just great getting those insights today. And for listeners to connect with our special guest today, who is David Braga. He's the CEO of International Justice Mission. You can connect with David at the website for International Justice Mission, ijm.org.au. ijm.org.au. David, thanks so much for taking some time to share what has been disturbing, but you haven't left us without hope, and you haven't left us without a call to action. And I want to appreciate you and honour you for the good work you're doing and the team that you've got working with you at International Justice Mission. Thanks so much for sharing these things with us today on 2020.
Thanks so much, Neil. God bless, and all the best, everyone.
Thanks for taking time to listen to this audio on demand from Vision Christian Media. To find out more about us, go to vision.org.au.